Thank you.
One of the keys to the Gates Foundation is that you push a business model, measurable goals, return on investment, return in this case being lives saved. Why are those kinds of metrics important?
Well, I've been lucky enough through my success and the unbelievable generosity of Warren Buffett to be at a foundation with my wife Melinda where we have a lot of resources. So it's nowhere near what government has, but by philanthropic standards, we have a responsibility to make sure this money has big impact. And we partner with governments taking on HIV, tuberculosis, malaria, all of these things that explain the inequity that a child in Africa is 100 times more likely to die than a child in the US or Europe.
Let's talk about child mortality because it is such a dramatic and clear example. In your Goalkeepers report, you do have this chart which shows that over the since 1990, the number of children under the age of 5 who die has gone from 11 million to 5 million. Then you project out to 2030 and you have 3 different scenarios. Explain the significance of those 3 different outcomes in terms of lives lost or saved.
Yeah, this is the first time that the aid field has been able to take our progress and not only track where we are, but also look at the possibilities for where we'll be 15 years ahead. So we took and we said if all the countries adopted the best practices, if the donors stay very generous in their giving, and if innovation's going full speed, and we show that as the best case, then we take just business as usual, and then we take a case where people pull back, where they're saying that they don't care as much about other countries and the deaths and things there, and that there's less money, less R&D, less adoption best practices, and we show it's quite a range.
It's more than 1 million young people in 2030 who either live or die. Specifically, the difference in terms of the various scenarios, what is it that wouldn't be getting there if people don't continue to contribute or even add to it?
Well, the best example is vaccines. Vaccines are fairly expensive, about $10 per child to get vaccinated. And it's donor money, the United States and the UK being the most generous, that buy those vaccines at the lowest possible price and get them out to all the world's children. And so the coverage keeps going up. And if we can get a few new vaccines into that mix and get the coverage level, which is 80%, up to 90%, then we achieve that very best case where more than 1 million lives a year, less kids will be dying by 2030.
That brings us to U.S. government funding, which President Trump is proposing to cut by almost a quarter in terms of global health funding. What would that mean in terms of either lives saved or lives lost?
We took HIV and we modeled what even just a 10% cut would mean. And it's an additional 5 million deaths between now and 2030. Because
5 million deaths.
5 million total deaths over that time period. What happens with an infectious disease? You're either winning by getting less and less people to be infected, and they infect less people, or you're losing. And in fact, the age cohort that's greatly at risk is age 16 to 25. There's twice as many kids now in that population range as there was back when HIV first hit. And so the miracle of getting those drugs out, if that's not fully funded until we get a breakthrough like a vaccine, then the death rate is going to go back up and reach new records.
In his speech to Congress in February, President Trump said this:
America must put its own citizens first, because only then can we truly make America great again.
And in his budget message, the president added, it is time to prioritize the security and well-being of Americans and to ask the rest of the world to step up and pay its fair share. Given that U.S. taxpayers at this point are basically putting up a third of the government funding around the world for global public health, doesn't President Trump have a point, and isn't there a case to be made the U.S. should cut back and other countries should step up?
Well, the United States is not giving percentage-wise as much as the European countries. The UK, Germany, Sweden, Norway give 3 times as much as a percentage of their economy. The US,
not in total dollars, but as a percentage
of their economy,
okay.
Yeah, which is viewed as the kind of the fair metric. The U.S. It has a huge economy, and what we have given is phenomenal. We also fund a lot of the research that's very important into creating these new tools. If we back off from the commitments that were actually made under President Bush, PEPFAR, the HIV and the malaria work come from his initiatives, then it would be tragic for these countries, for their stability, for having their health systems be able to stop pandemics early on. And so people like Secretary Mattis have said, if you cut the development budget, you're going to have to spend more on bullets because you're simply not there averting these problems of instability.
I wanted to ask you one more question about President Trump, because you met with him as president-elect in December. You met with him again in March, just after he had put out his budget. How did those conversations go?
Well, I had an opportunity in the 2 meetings I've had, November and March, to share with him my optimism that innovation in many areas, particularly in these global health issues, but also on energy and education, that the U.S. Can benefit itself in the world, and trying to see if the innovation agenda was something that resonated with him, because I think it's such a good deal, both domestically and for all of humanity. We talked about vaccines and how they're miraculous. We talked about these different programs, and so I'm hopeful that was enlightening to him.
But it didn't have the impact you hoped.
Well, in terms of the first budget that he came out with, no, that was a disappointment to us. It was taking the medical research budget, called the NIH, bringing that down fairly dramatically, taking the aid programs, including the ongoing HIV commitments, and bringing those. So definitely I was disappointed in that.
Did he explain it to you?
Well, I haven't seen him since that came out. There were rumblings that would happen, and he encouraged me to meet with various aides, including the Office of the Management of the Budget. And I do think the administration was new. I don't think they understood how difficult HIV is and what it means if you cut it back. And so we'll have to see, both in terms of the acceptance of what Congress does and their next budget. I hope that it's much more generous in these areas.
I want to talk about Congress, because you're now pushing them to put this money back into the budget. You admit that you and other folks like you have not done as good a job as you could in making the case for foreign aid. Perhaps in the moral sense you have, but you say not necessarily in the practical sense, even in terms of national security. So explain why you think this is so important in terms of what you call solvable human misery.
Well, it's always a challenge where a problem is far away that people don't get to see it. If you saw malaria and HIV in your neighborhood, of course, people would volunteer, the resources would come out. And that's why it was so phenomenal when President Bush said these drugs cost $100 a year. The U.S. is going to work to try and make sure no one dies because they lack those drugs. Whether it's instability that leads to migration, like Central America not being stable, and so that creates huge pressure at our borders that's a challenge for everyone, or Africa itself, where the population is going to more than double. Stability in the world can either be done militarily, or it can be done by making sure that the food and health and education is there. All these countries want to be self-sufficient. They don't, in the long run, want aid. And so countries like India are now rich enough that they're not a significant aid recipient. Brazil, Mexico, many countries have graduated. And so now we need to take the tougher cases, a lot of whom are in Africa, and continue to uplift them until they get out of the poverty trap.
We don't get to talk to you very often, so I'm going to take advantage of this and do a lightning round. Quick questions, quick answers. You are the leader of the Giving Pledge, getting billionaires to donate at least half their wealth to charity, to causes like this. How many people have you gotten to sign on, and how much money are we talking about?
It's 170 people. It's amazing. We never expected to get that many. The vast majority are from America, where we've spent more time talking to people. They're giving to a huge number of causes: education, scientific research. But we meet, we share experiences, we learn from each other, and the goal is to have the quality and the amount of charity go up. And many countries are envious of how strong that tradition is in the United States.
Finally, you had a famously tempestuous relationship with Steve Jobs. What do you think of the new iPhone, and what kind of phone do you use?
Well, actually, the relationship I have with Steve had every aspect you can imagine. Particularly in the last few years, our friendship, which had always been there, was greatly strengthened as he was dealing with cancer, as he had done such wonderful work at both Pixar and Apple. And, he and I had a lot in common. We were different in some ways. So, Steve was a genius, absolutely amazing. It's great that Apple's continuing to do good work. I happen to use all Windows-based PCs. The phone that I have recently, I actually did switch to an Android phone with a lot of Microsoft software. But the competition in the software and IT space that Steve helped foster, it's phenomenal, and Microsoft's a big part of that. It's been a miraculous industry that he and I got to work in.
So no iPhone?
No iPhone. Thank you.
Thank you. It's a pleasure talking to you. Please keep up the good work, sir. Up next, our Power Players of the Week. It's one thing to say you want to save millions of children, but how do you get life-saving medicine to some of the most remote places on Earth?